Resident Evil, a name that will summon many fond memories for so many people. The franchise that may not have invented survival horror, but definitely popularized it. Genuinely a franchise that at one point practically died due to overexposure and some shoddy products, and now is possibly one of the most consistently good franchises in all of gaming. I mean, of course you have things like Resident Evil 3 Remake, but if the worst thing you can look forward to is mediocrity, then I'd say you have a good little franchise. Recently, I've been on a bit of a Resident Evil kick. I got 4 Remake for Christmas, proceeded to binge it in a couple of days, and then went on to play the original version of 4, as well as 1, 2, and the remake of 1. These days, the franchise is split into 2 different tentpoles. You have the Remake series, which follows a third-person shooter-style format, and then you have the modern iterations that consist of a first-person shooter-style format. And it's strange how you have these 2 completely diametrically opposed styles, and yet they still work for their own reasons. I was dubious about something like Resident Evil 4 Remake at first, then I played it and couldn't stop playing it. With that said, seeing as over the previous few years they've been modernizing the backlog of Resident Evil, there have been a few notable gaps in their output. And some people have pointed to things like Code Veronica, or Survivor, or Zero as things that should be the next on the docket to be remade. And while I personally think all those should definitely be on the docket at some point, I honestly think the game that should get a remake at this point is a game that few ever bring to the conversation because it's the game that already did get a remake, but never got a remake in the modern style that they have right now, and that is the original game. I know what you're all gonna say. It's a ridiculous idea because it already got a remake, and in fact already had a remaster of that remake. Leaving aside the fact that Capcom has never been shy about updating their older Resident Evil games multiple times. I mean, how many times did Resident Evil 4 get rekajiggered? But I think the question of why Resident Evil 1 deserves another remake can be justified for one reason. Has anybody actually stopped and noticed that the original release of Resident Evil Remake came out in 2002? That is over 20 years ago. Several times longer than the gap between the original game and the remake. It may have already had a remake, but that doesn't discount the fact that said remake is now old enough to drink legally. And if the fact that it already had a remake is a disqualifying factor, when does that stop being the case? How old is old enough? Because Resident Evil 4 already got a remake, and that was several years newer than Resident Evil Remake. To be continued on that. And yeah, the remaster came out in 2014, but I wouldn't consider a remaster of a 2002 game to be a particularly noteworthy release for the company. Stick with me here. I'm sure there are a lot of people out there who played Resident Evil 2, 3, and 4 Remake who probably never bothered looking into whether or not the first game got a remake or remaster because a glorified re-release is never going to have the same clout as a brand new game. I'm speaking from personal experience. I bought Resident Evil 2 Remake because it was one of the most heavily publicized games of that time, and it took me a very long time to bother to check out the remaster of the very first game, and that's speaking as somebody who's somewhat of a casual fan and hasn't really been playing Resident Evil for that long. Because a precedent is set with a remaster that it is essentially the same game as a previous version with a few updates, and because of that mutual understanding between customers and creators, you're never going to be able to put the same amount of marketing into it. It's a feedback loop. Audiences will only get so excited, so the publishers can only stoke that excitement so much. A recent example would be the remasters of the early Tomb Raider games. They had a surprising amount of marketing put into them, and it looked like one of the better remasters ever made. Yet the marketing and hype were nowhere near as big as the marketing and hype for one of the previous new releases. So a lot of people are probably left in the dark on the original Resident Evil, and even if they aren't left in the dark due to not knowing about it, they may be left in the dark because they may not have the remaster because they felt it's not a big enough deal because it wasn't presented as that big of a deal. Besides, 2014, yeah, it wasn't a super long time ago comparatively, but it was still a somewhat long time ago. I was still in high school at the time, and even beyond the objective elements of the passage of time, I feel like there's a lot to be said on a design standpoint about giving the original Resident Evil another go. I mean, let's not kid ourselves, the original Resident Evil is second possibly only to Resident Evil 4 as far as pure iconic status in the series. Which makes sense, first entries are usually the most iconic, and yet I feel like there's still so much that could be done with it. We've never had a full official 3D rendering of the Spencer Mansion. It's always been pre-rendered. Hell, we've never even had a proper widescreen version of the mansion. I'd like to have a version where you can freely explore and look around as you choose. With the modern mechanics, there's more potential than ever when it comes to exploring and finding secrets. Some people aren't too fond of the modern crafting mechanics, but to me, that adds to the experience of having to plan your moves and risk making the wrong move and being screwed over later. They already started the idea of extra collectibles to play around with when they introduced the defensive items in the 2002 version, as well as various other new items. Then, with a fully viewable map, that gives the opportunity for puzzles based on your perception to be expanded upon. Because then the ability to spot various environmental items would be entirely based on the player and not the camera itself. There's so many ways that an updated version of the original game could benefit from being updated to be like the modern games. Plus, just because it's a remake, that doesn't mean they're obliged to go through all the same beats as before. I'm sure there would be some pushback over the idea that they'd be regurgitating old ideas instead of making properly new experiences, but that's also something a remake can thrive at. I know there are some things that people don't like about the remake, such as taking the gaudy colorfulness of the original Spencer Mansion and making it extremely dreary. Whereas before, the bright aesthetic juxtaposed against the eldritch horror that we were facing, but I think both versions have their charm. But what I love about the remake in particular is that it beats you over the head with your expectations. I went into it with the same mindset that I had in my several playthroughs of the original game and immediately got punched into mulch. There are entire new sections to the mansion that weren't there before. Shortcuts, new puzzles, new mechanics. It's a game that uses the framework of the original, but is a completely new game at the same time, and I feel like that's what the entire remake series has done so well, taking the framework, but has made entirely new experiences, for better and for worse. If you've ever played the B campaign of the original Resident Evil 2, you would know that Mr. X is one of the most embarrassing excuses for a super weapon in the history of the universe, not just the Resident Evil universe. He'll try to catch you with a quick jab that does barely any damage, and then attempts to hit you with an overhead strike that takes so long to wind up you can watch the entirety of the Lord of the Rings trilogy extended editions before it lands. But now Mr. X is one of the more iconic villains in modern gaming because of how they changed him to not only be much more vicious, but also be much more unpredictable. And I feel like there's an opportunity to once again play around with the puzzle pieces of this game in order to play with people's expectations, which makes things so much more interesting than they would have been otherwise. I'd love to see what a remixed version could look like once they change all the things to be in line with modern Resident Evil. Expanding the viewpoint because that opens you up to a whole new dimension of gameplay, and of course, look at all the story possibilities. There's a whole world of possibilities in improving what's there. Like how the guardhouse basement was greatly improved upon in the remake, making the mutated sharks go from a complete joke to a partial joke. It also made the grounds more than just a terminal between the mansion, the guardhouse, and the underground caves. And I don't want this to simply turn into a prolonged gushing session over the original remake, I just want to illustrate all the ways that it improved over the original version, and how many ways another go could improve on that if they get creative with it. I'm sure people more knowledgeable than me could do it justice. How can the mansion be improved? How can the guardhouse be improved? How can the mansion grounds be improved? And I think the most interesting question is, how can the underground lab be improved, given that I think in both cases the lab is kinda weak. Same goes for the Tyrant final boss. Despite ostensibly being a super weapon, he goes down with only a small handful of magnum bullets, making you wonder why you're saving all those things for him. I mean, I would say having the heart on the outside would probably be their first design mistake, but that's just me. I would personally like a version of the Tyrant final boss that isn't a complete piece of trash. More than anything though, I think they need to remake the original Resident Evil because they really need to fix and or reintroduce the continuity. The thing is, there's a lot of quirkiness with the original Resident Evil continuity that forces fans to create their own headcanons. I would say the most notable of which is this game's ending, or rather its endings, plural. Because in all recountings of the original game, the events have it play out where all four of the main characters escape on the helicopter. Chris, Jill, Barry, and Rebecca, but anybody who's completed both playthroughs of the original or the remake will know that there's no ending where all four characters escape. In Jill's playthrough, Rebecca is absent, but in Chris's playthrough, Barry is absent. I know it's a small detail, but it's kind of irritating to have to mentally fill in the blanks that some approximation of the events of Resident Evil 1 happened, but neither playthrough is necessarily canon. I'm sure there are some purists out there who would hate the idea of tampering with the continuity by adding either of these characters to the opposite playthrough, but I think the only reason anybody would be against it is purely for the reason of, well, that's how it's always been. I'm not sure if that's a popular take, but I'm sure some people will think that. But even going back to the 2002 release, there's absolutely no reason why they couldn't have Rebecca and Chris be in the cell in Jill's playthrough, then have Barry and Jill in the cell in Chris's playthrough. It's frustrating to someone like me who likes to follow chronological events to know that the actual chronology is frayed. So I feel like taking these remakes from the very beginning should be a chance to rekajigger the continuity and fit it all into a nice little box. I know that Capcom has the mindset of every aspect of the Resident Evil remake canon and original canon coexisting, but that's just cope to me. There's a reason why the modern games reference each other quite a bit, but never seem to reference events from the first game beyond vague details. Aside from the gap between Resident Evil 1 Remake and Resident Evil 2 Remake being almost 20 years, so it's anything but fresh in people's minds, making it a bit of an ask for players to know what's up, they also can't reference the first game because of these continuity issues, and if they could clean up the timeline a bit and have things play out in a definitively planned out way, I think the overall series would benefit. And I'm sure there are 100 different little continuity hiccups that they can easily fix by giving this game another chance. The fact of the matter is, there's no two ways about it. I believe the original Resident Evil deserves the remake treatment again. I think there are bigger fish to fry, most notably Code Veronica, because even though it never really held my interest long enough for me to beat it, I know that Code Veronica is definitely an extremely important part of the continuity. And that game, in my opinion, definitely has a lot of ways it can improve. But then after that, I'd say that Resident Evil 1 should be next up on the docket, and then if they're still doing remakes by that point, let's do 0. I guess in theory, the real philosophical conundrum here is now that they've remade 2, 3, and 4, they're plowing their way through the entire series, and at what point does it cease to be fulfilling from a fan standpoint and a creator standpoint that these games are being remade? I don't know yet. I guess we'll just have to wait and see. I mean, it's not like new games aren't being made, and I'm sure there's another shakeup that's gonna happen at some point, but as of right now, I think the series is in a healthy enough state that it can continue down the path it's going. For how long it can hold, who knows, but we'll burn that bridge when we get to it. But for now, that's all I've got, so if you like what I do here and want to support the channel, you can like this video, leave a comment telling me what you think, subscribe, and hit the notification icon so you're always up to date on what I'm doing. And if you want to support me in a more direct fashion, you can pledge to my Patreon for unique perks and rewards such as early access, Discord benefits, and exclusive content along with these fine folks right here. And an extra special thank you to Andrew Ritter, Brooklyn, Dick Kickham, Gaw004, My Name is Tank, Patchwork, Raph, Ranger X, Weird Webster, and Monsieur Thénardier for going above and beyond. Elsewise than that, I've been the King of Snark Style right here on Tactical Bacon Productions, and I will see you next time. Stay crispy, my friends.